friends. In the series that we have begun, today's lecture by Professor Payal Nagpal, who teaches in Janki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University. The lecture would be on T.S. Eliot's poetry in general. That will be in the background, but actually picking up one or two poems and looking at them intensively. But before she begins to talk, before I request her to do so, let me tell you that T.S. Eliot, as the poet in the 20th century, the poet in the 20th century, I use the definite article properly because he was a Nobel laureate and he, influenced generations and set a new trend. And he will be discussed by Professor Payal Nagpal. And there are a few questions I would like to ask straight away from her because that will help me understand her argument better. First, I've been hearing this word modernism quite a lot. And of course, generally we understand it, but from her angle, what is modernism? Because people have been modern in the 19th century, in the 18th century. Shakespeare is a modern author, and all those things. So, what is modernism? The way we have to understand it, and secondly, whether T.S. Eliot would fall in the category of modernist writing. So, these two queries I humbly make, and you please enlighten, and then maybe we can continue further.
Yes, thank you, Professor Prakash. It's an important point that you've raised about modernism and how we distinguish between these three terms, let's say modern, modernity and modernism. So, modernity will be something that is in a sense progressive and forward looking, and that can be ascribed in a sense to any particular movement or time period and so on. We can look at, you spoke about Shakespeare, so we can look at the Renaissance having a certain element of modernity, and how Shakespeare's plays are modern in their approach. But when we speak about modernism, there are so many things that actually go on to create this particular movement. But broadly speaking, if we were to look at some of the important aspects of modernism, so one was the whole idea of experimentation. And for instance, in the previous lecture also we looked at a lot of manifestos and a lot of movements from futurism to surrealism, impressionism and so on. So there are so many isms, and each particular movement looks at how they are going to break away from tradition and come up with a new form of expression. So within the genres remain the same, but how one can actually not simply tweak those genres but completely experiment and come up with a new vocabulary and a new way of expression. So it is this newness that constitutes modernism.
Well, this is a positive aspect of modernism, but people criticize it for its what is called reactionary nature,
yes.
for its stasis,
yes.
For the way it blocks certain visions of society and liking. Say something about that.
So where this is actually like one part of modernism, which is its origin. How does it come about? For us to understand the reactionary aspect, we also need to address the issue of where modernism is really speaking, coming from, where is it emerging. So as mentioned, that this is primarily about experimentation, new ways of looking, of defying boundaries. But having said that, the approach is in that sense very, very limited, because modernism rests heavily on the idea of fragmentation, on a certain kind of breakdown. It rests on a certain disconnect that it sees between the individual and society. And it is from this disconnect that the anxiety of the modernist individual emerges. And that does not lead, in a sense, to any kind of collective action or change. So it is not change oriented in that sense. It's change oriented at the level of aesthetics. But if we speak about a certain kind of social change that we were looking at, that is something that modernism doesn't give us. It's rooted in aesthetics.
Is T.S. Eliot a modernist in your opinion?
T.S. Eliot is a very, very interesting writer. We're discussing him as a poet. He's also written a lot of plays. He's written a lot of essays. And I think T.S. Eliot's own work is a classic example of what modernism high modernism and late modernism is all about. Because if we look at today, we will be discussing the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And Prufrock and other observations, this collection, which is in a sense the first poem, is the love song. It expresses, I think, this kind of fragmentation that we are talking about, the inability of the individual to connect to the society, to be an organic, integral part of the society. His early poems express this particular breakdown. But it's also related later in life when he converts, to Christianity and accepts the Anglican faith and the Church of England and so on. Then his poetry expresses a totally different pattern, which is very different from his early poetry. So, and this also, in a sense, kind of is coterminous with the changes that are taking place within modernism.
And because you already mentioned, the poem that you will be basically taking up and discussing, can you comment on the title of the poem? It seems to be a rather long title.
Yes.
For a poem.
So it's important that when we say the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, now the writers, the modernist writers, be it T.S. Eliot, the poets, they were all taken up with reacting to the romantics and the kind of aesthetics that the romantic poets brought in their poetry. And so when we look at the love song by T.S. Eliot, the poem is anything but a love song. And it's so dreary, and it raises so many questions that don't have answers, so many inabilities of the individual at multiple levels, that the poem is anything but a love song. But what T.S. Eliot is also saying, as a lot of the avant-garde writers of the time, is that the modern world is not something that is able to provide this kind of comfort to the individual.
And what is this name doing in the title of the poem? J. Alfred Prufrock.
Alfred Prufrock.
So pompous.
So yes, so longish title, and I think the longish title, the expectation of a reader, let's say, who's reading it for the first time, would think that there is something grand about this particular person, and so it's going to be played out. And a lot of critics have said that Prufrock is probably Prude plus Frock, and there was a furniture dealer by that name. So if one begins to kind of unpack Prufrock, there is, we get something extremely mundane. But
there might be also a play on the word of Prufrock, because frock means a Christian
yes,
kind of gown.
and combination of prude and frock. So the prude frock, in a sense.
Yes.
So certainly that is there, and so many references, biblical references, that are there in the poem. So this is.
Now, may I request you to start your argument, and let's know it. And
so this is a picture of T.S. Eliot. It's a photograph from 1934, and if we look at his life and times, and we've already spoken about the modern world and how it is not something that is that provides any comfort to the modern man. And when I say the modern man is the term that is used, and one is talking about humanity in that period. So he was born in 1888 and lived up to 1965, but there was a strong streak of religion there, because the grandfather was a Unitarian minister, and at the same time, apart from the streak of religion, which he actually reacted to, there was, when we talk about the city where he grew up, St. Louis, it was a prosperous space in the 19th century, and gradually, however, it turned into what is referred as urban decay. There were issues related to finance, political scandals, and so on. So his family represented, in fact, the term that's used is the Boston Unitarians or the Boston Brahmins, and they were against any kind of rationality that, even though they emerged out of the Calvin fold, but rationality was something that they opposed and were conservative, in a sense, in their approach. So this influence is there on Eliot, but Eliot, of course, he goes against it, and he goes towards the Anglican faith. And he was, while he was studying, he was greatly influenced. He did a course on literary criticism with Irving Babbitt, and studied philosophy, modern philosophy with George Santayana. And with Babbitt's influence, he also went on to study Sanskrit, Pali, and also Indian philosophy. And we can see a deep impact of all this in his, magnum opus, which would be The Wasteland. So he was influenced by, we spoke about modernism, and the writers at this time were influenced by a lot of other writers, and in this case, especially the French, so Baudelaire and Laforgue, and the medieval period, Dante, and we have, Bergson. So at the personal level, Eliot married Vivienne Haywood, and he was extremely unhappy with it. And the reason that this bit of personal detail is interesting, because there is a series of letters that he had written to his family friend Emily Hale, and those letters, they had decided that they were with Princeton University, and it was decided that 50 years after the deaths of either of these people would these be released, and they've only been released recently. So we now have new access to T.S. Eliot. This is a very, very new perspective, which, because the letters were not available, people were aware of it, but they were not available. So he was also greatly influenced by Ezra Pound, and Pound introduced him to the to important writers of the period, Wyndham Lewis, H.T., Richard Aldington, and so on. And of course, in London, there was T. Hume, and Hume, of course, felt that no verse should be allowed to, no form of verse should be allowed to continue for more than 20 years. So anything that was more than 20 years old should be destroyed. And then there was Ford Madox Ford. So when we look at his conversion, we need to keep in mind that the embracing a particular faith for Eliot also meant that he went through that period of skepticism, and this is evident in the different poems that we see that were written by him. So I think different aspects of Eliot's life are very clearly borne out in the way in which he is writing, both at the level of form and content. So as mentioned about Emily Hale, and after her death, how these letters were revealed, and how Hale herself was actually quite disturbed at the fact that the second time when he got married to his secretary Valerie Fletcher, that was very disturbing for Hale, because there was a bond that Emily Hale and T.S. Eliot shared. So with this, we move into a discussion of what poetry at this time really meant, and
could you tell a little more about the letters that was revealed?
So actually, initially, T.S. Eliot really liked Emily Hale, and there's a possibility that he had actually also proposed to Hale, but they had performed together in plays and so on. So there was a soul connect there, there was a literary intellectual connect there, and there was a solid epistolary exchange between the two. But Eliot probably destroyed all the letters that Hale had written to him, but Hale had preserved the letters that T.S. Eliot wrote.
No, but he was married to somebody else.
Yes, yes.
And why? If he was in love with, or he had connect with.
So the first
is
marriage,
it revealed in the letters?
Well, one will have to go through all of them, but the little that I know of this, I can share, which is that to begin with, he was very upset with about his marriage with Vivienne Haywood, because she wouldn't keep well, and it was something that she had probably not disclosed to T.S. Eliot, and so his letters were a lot about that. They were a lot about his writing, his poetry, and there was a kind of assumption that Hale, after Vivienne Haywood, he would probably get married to Emily Hale, and his marriage to Valerie Fletcher just takes her absolutely by surprise. And T.S. Eliot, on his part, probably said that if he had married Emily Hale, the poet in him would have been destroyed. So, so there is this, and one will of course have to, go through this in-depth analysis.
This is a very important detail
Yes.
about him, and he was a broken man to begin with. So maybe modernism would have been one of the symptoms of that brokenness of his mind or heart.
Yes. So, which is why this little bit of personal detail was very, very interesting. And I think if one were to actually read Hale's, his letters to Hale, I think we would get an entirely new perspective on the writer. So, though of course, as Pound says, and he says, once T.S. Eliot dies, he says, "I can only repeat, but with urgency of 50 years ago, read him." So, I think if we have to understand modernism, the modernist period, it's very important to read T.S. Eliot, and rightfully so. I think every course on modernism actually has poetry by T.S. Eliot. And so for a lot of the references, I've relied heavily on Professor Manju Jain's book. She had retired from Delhi University and had brought out a seminal book on T.S. Eliot. And I think right from the undergrad days, we all refer to it very often. So she says that the movement towards, and this is a statement that describes the connection between the writer and the period very well. She writes, "The movement towards abstraction heightened the contradictions and tensions that were latent in early modernism. If there was an apotheosis of individualism and a critique of established traditions and institutions, there was also a denial of the primacy of the human subject and an insistence on the autonomy of art whose laws were considered to be independent of human will." So I think this statement actually gives us a lot about the connection, the relationship between the individual and society. The fact that it's not there. The individual is not humanized by the society in a certain way that I think the 19th century maybe looked at the entity of the human being, and then about art, about literature, the laws, and how there is a freedom, but it doesn't lead to any kind of again get back to the question you had raised at the beginning, that it does not lead to any kind of constructive, cohesive action for society.
In fact, the individual has become the main concern of the early 20th century writing, and people look at the society not from its structures, from the oppressions that exist in life, but from the individual's point of view, where his particular situation is sought to be captured by the writing. So that's true, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good point that you're making. As per Manju Jain's, insights here. Yes.
And in fact, when we look at T.S. Eliot's early poetry, it is, the early modernism that we're looking at, because the love song is from the collection which is titled Prufrock and Other Observations, and this was published in 1917. If we look at it, he starts writing somewhere around 1910, and this is brought out in 1917. So we are looking at a period that is pre-First World War, which means that there would be some kind of churning in the society, and 1914 to 18 being the First World War. This is published in 1917. So this also, in a sense, if he was writing in 1910, 11, 12, the poems are prescient in a certain way, because we look at the First World War, and right in the middle of it comes out this collection. The landscape, the social, political, cultural landscape would be very, very desolate. I wouldn't say barren, but it would be alienating in a certain sense. And the individual would not, really speaking, feel at home, so to say, in the world that is there. So this book was dedicated to his friend Jean Verneuil, and we can say that two important aspects that we need to understand to unpack Alfred Prufrock here is one, the whole idea of the dramatic monologue, and the other is the objective correlative. So these are two very important aspects, and the objective correlative also stems from a kind of idea that was there by the French poet Lafoque, who had talked about dedoublement, where the individual is split in, the self is split into the subject and the object. The subject and object are not two different entities, but the self has, in a sense, disintegrated. It's this disintegration that Alfred Prufrock brings to the reader, and to actually talk about the objective correlative, which T.S. Eliot mentions in an essay on Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet. He says, "The only way of expressing emotion in the form of art is by finding an objective correlative." In other words, what is the objective correlative? A set of objects, a situation, a chain of events that become like a formula of that particular emotion. So, such that when the external facts that must terminate in sensory experience are given, the emotion is immediately evoked. Which means that we also know that Pound was, he was an imagist also. So, this creation of the image is very closely allied to the creation of the emotion. So, to look at the very first, the epigraph, where which says that if I thought that my reply, it is to be translated into English, it's not in English, it says that this is from Dante, and Guido says that if I thought that my reply would be to one who would never return to the world, this flame will shake no more. But since none ever did return alive from this depth, if what I hear be true, without fear of infamy, I answer thee. So, where the individual is trapped in this hell and there is no going out of this hell, which means that the poem has started with an element of stasis. So,
Well, I think the background is very clear regarding T.S. Eliot's poetic vision, and which is expressed in this poem, and you have referred to certain intellectual movements at the time, and the idea of objective correlative that is independent of the emotion, because it's just there, and it helps you evoke the sensation or the feeling that is enshrined in the poem. So that's the concept that he used also to criticize Hamlet, as you have pointed out. I think all these things, friends, tell us about a person who was responding very acutely and very, very alertly to the tumultuous period that the First World War was presenting in its own way. And this poem is both serious and both non-serious, and serious and non-serious are in fact inseparable so far as the poem is concerned, because that is the essence of the First World War, where there is no locus standi, where there is no aim, there is no purpose, there is no idealism, and yet people are one against the other, and they are destroying in the process also the society of the time. So all this is reflected in your argument, and I'm sure that when it is extended to the in-depth study of this poem, then more will become clear. So friends, in the second part, Professor Payal Nagpal will tell us more about the poem Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, written by T.S. Eliot in the wake of the First World War. As she has pointed out, the collection came later, but this poem particularly would have been written in I think 1913 or 1914, and that's also the beginning of the First World War. So we look forward to the explanation that Professor Payal Nagpal will present in the second part of the discussion. Thank you.